The morning shift at Newport Maritime Yard began the same way it had for 200 years, with the smell of salt water and hot steel and the particular silence of men who understood that the sea did not forgive careless work. Cranes groaned overhead, their arms sweeping against a pale Virginia sky. Welding arcs threw brief white light across the belly of USS Meridian, the largest commercial vessel Ashford Maritime had commissioned in a decade. $240 million of steel and ambition sitting in dry dock like a promise not yet kept. The men who built her moved around her hull with the unhurried precision of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had no need to prove it. Daniel Rowe was on his knees in the lower starboard section, electrode in hand, when he heard the convoy arrive. He did not look up immediately. The bead he was laying required his full attention, a continuous fillet along a structural bracket that would bear significant load once the ballast tanks pressurized. His hands moved with the kind of economy that cannot be faked or learned quickly, the motion living somewhere below conscious thought. In the muscle memory of a man who had spent decades understanding how steel behaved under stress. The weld was clean. He pulled his helmet up and examined it the way a surgeon might examine a closed incision, not with pride, but with the quiet expectation of correctness. Only then did he turn. The convoy was 3 black SUVs and a white corporate shuttle, and they had parked with the careless confidence of people who did not worry about blocking access routes. A woman stepped out first, and the entire yard seemed to register her presence before any individual man consciously noticed her. Claire Ashford was 39 years old and carried herself with the tension of someone who had spent her adult life earning authority in rooms designed to exclude her. Her suit was charcoal gray, fitted without being conspicuous, and she moved across the yard floor in heels that should have been impractical on a surface covered in steel shavings and hydraulic fluid, but somehow were not. Her assistant, a young man named Graham who had been with her for 4 months, and still flinched when she raised an eyebrow, hurried 3 steps behind, tablet clutched to his chest. She had not been to this yard in 11 months. The men knew it. The kind of attention she drew was not admiration, but assessment, the way a crew evaluates a change in weather. Daniel turned back to his work. He was fitting his helmet back into position when Graham reached him, stepping carefully around a coil of welding cable with the exaggerated caution of someone unused to the floor. "Mr. Rowe." The voice was apologetic in the way that people are when they are delivering someone else's decision. Daniel straightened slowly, the way a man straightens when his knees have spent too many years on concrete. He was broad through the shoulders in the manner of physical work rather than a gym, and his hands, when he pulled off his welding gloves, were the kind of hands that told a specific story. Calloused at the palm, scarred at the knuckles, with the faint chemical staining that never quite washed out. Ms. Ashford would like a word. He already knew what kind of word it was. Claire Ashford stood in the open center of the yard where the acoustics carried, and she did not lower her voice when she spoke. That was the point. 200 men were working within earshot, and she understood, whether consciously or not, that what she was about to say would carry more weight as a public statement than a private one. 7 years, she said, looking at a clipboard Graham had handed her rather than at Daniel directly, the way people sometimes avoid eye contact when they've already made a decision they know is wrong, but intend to execute anyway. 7 years on this floor, and the only thing in your file is attendance. No certifications, no advancement. You're costing this company more than you're contributing. The yard had gone quiet. Not completely. The cranes still moved, and somewhere on the upper deck, A pneumatic tool continued its rhythm, but the quiet of men pretending to work while listening, a different kind of quiet entirely. Daniel said nothing. "Clean out your station." Her eyes finally met his, and what was in them was not cruelty, but something colder, the arithmetic of a person who had already run the numbers and moved on. "Security will escort you out." He looked at her for a long moment, not with anger. That would have been too simple, and Daniel Rowe had not been a simple man even before life had complicated him further. What crossed his face was something more difficult to read, a weathered patience that had long since made peace with the unfairness of certain transactions. He pulled his welding gloves off the rest of the way. He unclipped his helmet from his belt. He set both items on top of his toolbox with the careful deliberateness of a man performing a ritual he had no intention of rushing for anyone's convenience. Then he picked up a canvas bag from beneath his station, slung it over his shoulder, and began walking toward the yard exit. The crowd parted for him, not because anyone told them to. The men simply stepped back, one by one, creating a corridor through which Daniel walked without looking left or right. Some of them had worked beside him for years. They knew, in the way that people who do physical work together come to know things about each other without ever discussing them, that this man carried something they could not name but recognized. The parting was instinctive, like the way water moves around a specific kind of stone. Claire Ashford watched him go. Something crossed her expression that she did not allow to settle. Daniel was 30 feet from the exit gate when the alarm sounded. It was not a fire alarm. The tone was lower, more deliberate. The emergency klaxon wired directly to the dry dock monitoring system, the one that activated when the structural sensors detected something outside normal parameters. Daniel stopped walking. He did not run back, did not turn dramatically. He simply stopped and looked toward USS Meridian the way a person looks at something they already understand. The tilt was barely visible to the untrained eye. 4 degrees, maybe 4.5. The bow of the vessel was settling fractionally lower on the port side, a movement so gradual that the monitoring system had caught it before the crew on deck even registered the change in their footing. But 4 degrees in a dry dock with a fully pressurized ballast configuration and a $240 million hull that was scheduled to receive 500 guests for a launch ceremony in less than 6 hours was not a minor deviation. It was the beginning of a sequence that had a specific and expensive conclusion. The yard erupted. Marcus Cole, the lead structural engineer, a man with 2 graduate degrees and 15 years of commercial shipbuilding experience, had his team running within 90 seconds. They pulled up schematics on portable screens, called up the ballast monitoring software, cross-referenced the sensor data with the morning inspection logs. Voices overlapped. Someone was already on a phone to the corporate office. Claire Ashford stood in the middle of the controlled chaos with the expression of a person calculating exposure in real time. Daniel watched from the gate. He watched the way a doctor watches an incorrect diagnosis being pursued with great confidence and energy. He watched Marcus's team move to the starboard ballast control panel and begin running diagnostics that were going to take 12 minutes to complete and return no useful information because the diagnostics were looking in the wrong place. He watched the tilt continue its patient, incremental progress. 4 degrees becoming 4.3, the monitoring system updating every 90 seconds. He set his bag down. He walked back. Nobody stopped him. The security guard at the interior checkpoint was watching the commotion around USS Meridian with the expression of a man who had not been trained for this specific situation. Daniel walked past him and directly to the lower starboard section of the hull, where the ballast valve access panel for Section 7C was located behind a maintenance crawl space that most of the current crew would not have been able to identify without a schematic. He crouched down, opened the access panel with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had opened it many times before, not in this yard, but in vessels built to the same fundamental logic, and looked at the valve orientation for approximately 4 seconds. He stood up and turned around. Marcus was 15 feet away, running a diagnostic cable to a monitoring port on the opposite side of the hull. Daniel looked at him steadily. Ballast valve, Section 7C. The words were quiet enough that only the 3 men nearest him could hear them. It's locked in the wrong direction. Whoever configured it last night did it backward. Your port side tank is taking on water that's supposed to be equalized across both chambers. You have, he checked his watch, a functional analog that he had owned for a long time. Roughly 37 minutes before the keel sustains stress damage that won't be repairable before the launch window. Marcus stared at him. Check it, Daniel said. There was a specific kind of silence that falls in a room when someone says something that everyone simultaneously hopes is wrong and fears is right. Marcus looked at Daniel for 2 seconds, taking in the canvas bag, the dismissed worker with no credentials in his file, the man who had just been publicly escorted out, and then he looked at the access panel that Daniel had already opened. He crossed the distance in 4 strides, went down on one knee, and looked at the valve. He stood up. The color had changed in his face. He's right. Marcus said it to no one in particular, but it carried. Port ballast valve 7C is inverted. How the hell did... He stopped himself, already moving, already pulling his radio. The diagnostic team changed direction like a school of fish responding to a shift in current. The silence that followed lasted less than 3 seconds before it became a great deal of noise. Claire Ashford pushed through the ring of engineers and technicians that had formed around the section and stopped when she reached Daniel. She was a composed woman who had navigated a board of directors that had not wanted her, earnings calls during quarters that had not cooperated, and a father's legacy that had arrived with as many liabilities as assets. But composure and stillness are different things, and right now she was very composed and completely still. How did you know? Daniel picked up his canvas bag from where he'd left it beside the access panel. 36 minutes now. I'm asking you a question. His eyes met hers with the particular patience of a man who has learned that some answers are better demonstrated than explained. Your team knows what to do. Let them do it. The valve adjustment takes 11 minutes if your engineer knows the torque sequence for this ballast configuration. If he doesn't, it takes 24. You don't have 24. Something moved through Claire Ashford's expression that was not quite admiration and not quite anger, but lived in the complicated territory between them. She turned to Marcus. How long? Marcus didn't look up from the valve housing. 18, maybe 16. 14 if he uses a counterclockwise reset before the primary torque sequence, Daniel said. Not loudly, not as a challenge, simply as a fact that was sitting there unused. Marcus looked up at him, a long look, then, walk me through it. Daniel set his bag down again. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform the knowledge for the audience that had accumulated around them. The technicians, the security personnel, the 3 members of Claire Ashford's corporate team who were recording everything on their phones. He spoke to Marcus with the directness of one professional to another in the shorthand of shared technical vocabulary, and Marcus's hands moved in response to the information the way hands move when they're receiving something they recognize as correct. 11 minutes and 40 seconds later, the port ballast chamber began equalizing. The tilt reversed. The monitoring system updated. 3.1 degrees, 2.4, 1.7. The klaxon, which had been cycling continuously for the past quarter hour, was manually silenced by someone in the control booth. The silence it left behind had a different quality than the silence before. Not the quiet of men pretending to work, but the quiet of 200 people exhaling simultaneously without realizing it. Daniel picked up his canvas bag for the third time that morning. He was genuinely walking toward the exit when he heard Claire Ashford's voice behind him, not raised. She did not need to raise her voice to make it carry. "Where do you think you're going?" It was not quite a question. Daniel stopped but did not turn around immediately. Beyond the yard gates, through the chain link and the sodium lights of the access road, he could see the parking lot where his truck was the oldest vehicle by a considerable margin. A 1987 Ford F-150 that he kept running through the same combination of institutional knowledge and refusal to give up on things that still had useful work left in them. The morning had the particular clarity of a day that has not yet decided what it intends to become. "You fired me," he said, still facing the gate. "I'm aware of what I did." A pause that had weight in it. "I'm reconsidering." He turned around slowly, looked at her across the 20 feet of yard floor between them, with the ballast crisis resolved and the normal sounds of the yard beginning to resume around them, cranes and pneumatic tools, and the low percussion of metal on metal. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. There were too many things moving through it at once. The corporate calculus was still there, because it was always there with people like her, but something else had been added to it. He had seen it before, in senior officers, in the moment when they realized they had been given correct information by a source they had already decided to dismiss. The thing they had already decided settled uneasily next to the thing they had just learned. "My termination paperwork is probably already processing," Daniel said. "Graham." Claire did not look away from Daniel. "Stop the paperwork." Yes, stopping it now." Graham was already on his phone. Daniel looked at the gate. He looked at the 1987 truck beyond it. He looked at the yard around him. The USS Meridian sitting level now in her dry dock, the monitoring system green across every indicator, the crew returning to their stations with the relieved efficiency of men whose crisis has passed, but whose workday has not. Somewhere in the city, 11 miles from this yard, his daughter was eating breakfast before school and managing her insulin levels with the particular competence of an 11-year-old who had been doing it long enough to treat it as simply another part of mornings. He had promised her he would be home before 8. There were approximately 9 hours between now and 8 o'clock. He set his bag down. "You have 6 hours before that launch ceremony," he said, "and whoever inverted that valve did it deliberately. That wasn't a mistake." He let that land, watched it register in her eyes. The shift from relief back to something sharper, which means you have a bigger problem than a ballast malfunction. The yard hummed around them. Somewhere overhead, a crane began its slow rotation. Claire Ashford stood very still in the middle of her $240 million problem, and for the first time that morning, she looked at Daniel Rowe as though she was seeing something she had not expected to find. She was right, but she did not yet know how right she was, or how little she understood about the man standing in front of her with a canvas bag over his shoulder and 7 years of silence finally beginning to crack at the edges. Graham's fingers moved across his tablet with the focused urgency of someone who understood that the next 15 minutes would determine whether his employment continued past the week. Claire had given him one instruction: find everything, and he had interpreted it the way good assistants interpret broad directives, not as a starting point, but as a destination, the path to which required every available resource deployed simultaneously. He pulled the personnel file first. It was, as advertised, nearly empty. 7 years of clock-in records, perfect attendance, a single commendation from a floor supervisor named Briggs who had retired 2 years ago. No certifications on file, no educational history, no prior employment listed beyond a vague reference to government contractor 2008 to 2015. The gap between those two dates and the man currently standing 40 feet away, reconfiguring a ballast diagnostic protocol that 3 credentialed engineers had spent 20 minutes failing to organize. That gap was a door, and Graham pushed through it. The second database returned results in under 4 minutes. He walked to Claire with the tablet held slightly away from his body, the way people carry things they're not sure how to characterize. She took it without looking away from the dry dock floor, where Daniel had positioned himself beside Marcus and was pointing at something in the valve housing with the unhurried authority of a man conducting a lesson he has given many times. Then she looked down at the screen. The silence that followed lasted longer than Graham expected. MIT Naval Architecture, class of 1997. Graduate with distinction. Doctoral research in structural load distribution for deep water pressure hulls, completed 1999. Commission as a civilian specialist with the United States Navy, attached to the Virginia-class submarine development program at Newport News Shipbuilding. Lead structural designer on 4 vessels. 3 patents filed between 2004 and 2012. All assigned to the Department of Defense, all still classified. A commendation from the Secretary of the Navy in 2011 that referenced, in language so carefully bureaucratic it almost concealed its meaning, a specific incident during sea trials in which Daniel Rowe's intervention had prevented a catastrophic pressure failure and saved the lives of everyone aboard. Resigned March 2015. Reason, personal. That was the entire official record. 7 words where there should have been a paragraph, a form, an exit interview, a human resources notation. The ordinary documentation of an extraordinary career ending. Instead, personal. As though the Navy had agreed, collectively and quietly, to leave a door unlocked out of respect for a man who had earned the right to walk through it without explanation. Claire read it twice. Then she looked up at Daniel, who was now crouched beside the lower access panel again, explaining something to Marcus in the tone of a man who finds the work itself more interesting than the audience watching him do it. His canvas bag sat on the floor 3 feet away. His welding helmet was clipped to his belt out of habit, even though he had no current reason to wear it. "Who is he?" she said, not to Graham, to herself. Graham answered anyway. "I'm still pulling." He took the tablet back and kept working. The morning moved around Daniel's investigation the way water moves around something fixed. He had identified, within the first 20 minutes of returning to the floor, that the valve inversion in Section 7C was not an isolated error. It was precise. It was deliberate. And it had been done by someone who understood the Meridian's ballast architecture well enough to choose the single point of intervention that would produce maximum structural stress with minimum immediate visibility. The kind of sabotage that looked like a configuration mistake until a vessel was already committed to its launch sequence, and correction became impossible without dry dock access, This was not the work of a disgruntled contractor or a junior technician cutting corners. This was knowledge applied with intent, and the specificity of it told Daniel something he was not yet ready to say out loud. He said other things instead, technical things. He walked Marcus through a secondary check of the portside sensor array, not because he expected to find additional damage, but because he needed to map what had been touched and what had not. He asked questions about the overnight access log, who had been in the yard between 11 and 4, what credentials had been used at which checkpoints, whether the dry dock monitoring system had flagged any anomalies before the morning shift started. Marcus answered what he could and made calls for the rest. The picture assembled itself gradually, the way pictures do when someone is looking at it honestly rather than looking for a specific answer. At 9:34, Daniel's phone rang. He stepped away from the diagnostic station, out of earshot of the crew. The contact name on the screen was a single word, Lily. He answered before the second ring. Her voice came through with the brightness specific to an 11-year-old who has been awake long enough to have opinions about the day. Dad, I figured out the keel ratio on that model ship, the one you left on my desk. I used the formula from the book and I got a different number than the answer in the back, and I think the book is wrong. Something shifted in his face that had not shifted for anyone else that morning. What number did you get? 0.47. The book says 0.52. A pause. Check your beam measurement. You might be using the waterline beam instead of the maximum beam. Silence on her end. The soft sound of a pencil being picked up. Then, yeah, okay. That makes more sense. A beat. Are you coming home for dinner? Before 8, he said. How are your levels this morning? Fine. Mrs. Garrett checked before school. I'm fine, Dad. I know you are. You worry too much. Occupational hazard, he said. The dry humor was quiet enough that it almost wasn't there. The kind of joke that lives at the edge of something more serious and doesn't ask to be laughed at. He heard her smile through the phone. Okay, I'll be home. Don't forget, Mrs. Garrett leaves at 6. He ended the call and stood still for 3 seconds with the phone in his hand, looking at nothing in particular. Then he put it in his pocket and walked back to the diagnostic station. Claire was waiting there. She had dismissed the rest of her team to the conference trailer and was standing alone beside the access panel with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who has just finished reading something that rearranged several previously settled conclusions. Virginia-class submarines, she said, not an accusation, not quite a question. Daniel picked up the diagnostic readout Marcus had left on the workbench and reviewed it without answering. You designed 4 of them. The structural components of 4 of them, he said, still reading. There's a difference. Your file here says you have no educational background. My file here says a lot of things that aren't true. He set the readout down. Someone filled it out that way deliberately. I let them. He looked at her directly. That's a separate conversation. Right now, the relevant conversation is that whoever inverted that valve had access to this yard overnight, had specific knowledge of this vessel's ballast configuration, and chose Section 7C because it's the least visible point of intervention in the dry dock monitoring grid. That's not public information. That's in the engineering documents. Claire's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. You're saying it was someone with inside access. I'm saying the valve didn't invert itself. The silence between them had a different quality than the earlier ones. Earlier, the silences had been about power, who held it, who was performing it, who was deciding how much to concede. This one was about something they were both looking at together, an unpleasant fact sitting between them on the workbench next to the diagnostic readout, waiting for someone to pick it up. Graham reappeared at the edge of the dry dock with the expression of a man who has found something he wishes he hadn't. He reached Claire and turned the tablet so only she could see it, lowering his voice. She read. Her jaw tightened by a fraction that most people would not have noticed. Daniel noticed. "What?" he said. She turned the tablet toward him. The security footage timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The dry dock access checkpoint. Camera 3. A man in a gray jacket moving through the gate with a contractor badge, head angled slightly away from the camera with the deliberateness of someone who had memorized the camera positions. The face was partially obscured, but the badge number was visible, and Graham had already run it, and the badge number belonged to Preston Hale, who was currently standing 60 feet away in a cluster of Ashford Maritime's senior leadership team, talking to two members of the corporate board with the focused attentiveness of a man demonstrating that he takes his responsibilities seriously. Daniel looked at the image. Then he looked at Preston Hale across the yard floor. Preston Hale was 47 years old and had been Ashford Maritime's CFO for 6 years, brought in by Claire's father 2 years before the elder Ashford's retirement, and retained by Claire in the transition because he knew the company's financial architecture in a way that would have taken an outsider years to replicate. He was an unremarkable-looking man in the specific way that makes people easy to underestimate. Medium height, careful dresser, the kind of face that business environments produce in abundance. He was laughing at something one of the board members had said. As though he felt the attention, he glanced toward the dry dock floor. His eyes found Daniel's for less than 2 seconds before he looked away. In those 2 seconds, Daniel understood something. Not everything. Not yet. But the specific quality of that glance, the absence of surprise in it, the performance of unconcern that was slightly too practiced, told him that Preston Hale had known when he walked through that gate at 11:47 p.m. with a contractor badge that a man named Daniel Rowe worked the morning shift on this floor, had known it, and had made a calculation that did not account for the possibility that this particular morning shift worker would identify the problem before it became irreversible. The calculation had been wrong. That tended to make people like Preston Hale make additional calculations. "Don't confront him," Daniel said, quietly enough that only Claire heard. "Not yet. If he knows we have the footage, he'll move whatever else he has in place." Claire looked at him. "You're telling me how to handle my own CFO." "I'm telling you how to protect your vessel. You can handle your CFO however you like, after." A beat. She turned away from Preston Hale and looked at the Meridian. "You said there's a bigger problem than the valve. How much bigger?" Daniel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He had been turning it over since the moment he examined the valve orientation and recognized the technical precision behind it, the kind of precision that belonged to a specific category of training. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. That level of knowledge doesn't stop at one intervention. The launch ceremony was in 5 hours and 40 minutes. Claire absorbed this the way she absorbed most difficult information, without visible reaction, the processing happening somewhere interior and fast. Then we find everything before it matters. That's the idea. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone revising a prior assessment in real time, caught in the uncomfortable gap between who she had decided he was at 8 o'clock this morning and who the evidence was insisting he was now. There was something in it that was almost an apology, though it hadn't yet assembled itself into that shape. "Why did you come back?" "After I—" She stopped herself. Daniel looked at the Meridian. $240 million. 500 guests in 5 hours. A vessel that 200 men had spent 18 months building with their hands. Some things are worth more than being right about being wronged. He picked up the diagnostic readout again. "We're wasting time." She nodded once, the nod of a person accepting terms she had not set, and turned to Graham. "Get me the complete overnight access log, every checkpoint, every badge, and find out what Preston Hale told the maintenance crew about the Section 7C inspection schedule." Graham was already moving. Daniel, for his part, was already somewhere else. Not physically, but in the focused interior space where his mind went when a problem had fully claimed it. He was thinking about the technical signature he had found in the valve inversion, the specific torque pattern, the choice of Section 7C over the more obvious intervention points. It was a signature he almost recognized, the fingerprint of a methodology, a way of thinking about mechanical systems that he had encountered before, in a different context, in a different time, in the particular intimacy of teaching someone something you love and watching them become proficient. He had trained a lot of people over the years, at Annapolis, at Newport News, in the smaller, less formal contexts of a career that had moved between institutions and projects. Most of them he remembered clearly. One of them he was beginning to think about now, with a feeling that had no clean name. Not quite dread, not quite grief, something that lived at the intersection of those two things, and carried with it the specific weight of having been trusted completely, and having trusted in return. He set the thought aside. There was work to do first, but it stayed at the edge of his attention the way certain things do. Not gone, not resolved, just waiting for the moment when the rest of the picture caught up with it, and there was no longer any way to look at something else instead. Outside, beyond the chain link and the access road and the pale Virginia morning, the Atlantic moved against the mouth of the harbor with its customary indifference to human arrangements. The tide did not know about launch ceremonies or CFOs or 7-year silences or the particular loneliness of a man who had made himself invisible and was now, against every intention, beginning to be seen. The monitoring system showed green across every indicator. It would not show green for long. The access log printed to 4 pages, and Daniel read all of them standing at the workbench without sitting down, the way he read things when the information mattered. Not skimming for highlights, but moving through it line by line, the way you move through a compartment you suspect has been tampered with, checking everything because the thing you're looking for is almost certainly not where you expect it. Preston Hale's badge had activated checkpoint 3 at 11:47 p.m. It had deactivated at 12:31 a.m. 44 minutes. Enough time to reach Section 7C through the maintenance corridor, invert the valve, and leave through the same checkpoint without triggering the automated anomaly flag, which required a minimum 60-minute after-hours stay before generating an alert. Whoever had designed this entry had known the threshold. That was not public information either. Daniel set the log down and looked at the ceiling of the dry dock, the crane rails and the sodium lights and the structural web of a facility that had been building ships since before his father was born. The Meridian sat in her dock below him, level now, her monitoring systems reporting normalcy with the bland confidence of instruments that can only measure what they've been designed to detect. He picked up a grease pencil from the workbench and drew a small circle on the corner of the access log. Then he went back to work. Claire watched him from the upper walkway for longer than she intended to. She had come up to take a call from the board. Richard Ashby, the senior independent director, who had heard about the morning's incident from someone on her own team before she'd had a chance to frame it herself, which told her something useful about the efficiency of certain information channels she had previously assumed were under her control. She handled Ashby the way she handled most things she hadn't chosen, directly, without apology, converting the vulnerability of the situation into the vocabulary of competence. There had been a configuration anomaly. It had been identified and corrected. The launch would proceed. Yes, she was confident. When she ended the call, she was still watching Daniel. He was at the secondary pump housing on the port side now, doing something with a pressure gauge and a hand tool that she couldn't identify from this distance, but that every man on the floor within 20 feet of him had apparently decided required their attention. They were not crowding him. They were doing the thing that experienced workers do around someone whose competence they recognize instinctively, staying close enough to learn something while maintaining the pretense of their own tasks. Marcus had stopped pretending entirely and was simply standing next to Daniel, listening to whatever he was saying with the focused attention of a graduate student who has just realized the visiting lecturer is not who the program notes suggested. Claire descended the walkway stairs and crossed the floor. She reached Daniel as he was replacing the gauge housing cover, his movements unhurried and exact. She had prepared a sentence on the way down, something about the overnight access log, something managerial, but what came out instead was, "What are you looking for?" He finished tightening the housing cover before he answered. "I'm not looking for anything specific. I'm mapping what was touched and what wasn't. Whoever did this chose Section 7C because it was sufficient. That tells me either they only needed one point of intervention to achieve their objective, or they had time constraints that limited them to one." He stood and looked at the hull. "I want to know which. Because if it was time constraints, then there may be a second visit planned." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, as information. The launch is the window. After she's in the water, access to the hull is different, harder to attribute. Claire looked at the Meridian, then at Preston Hale, who was still with the board members on the far side of the yard, his back to them now, his posture carrying the relaxed assurance of a man at a social function. She had worked alongside Preston for 6 years. She had relied on his institutional knowledge through the transition from her father's leadership to hers, had trusted his read on the financial architecture of a company she'd inherited without a complete map. The footage from Checkpoint 3 was 44 minutes of her trust being used against her, and the anger that produced was clean and cold, and she was keeping it in a separate room until it was useful. "What do you need?" she said. Daniel looked at her with the mild surprise of someone who had expected a different kind of conversation. "Access to the engineering documents, the original ballast configuration specs, not the as-built drawings. And I need someone to walk me through every modification that was made to the monitoring system in the last 6 months. Marcus can do that." "I know. I need your authorization so he doesn't have to choose between helping me and following your org chart." She took out her phone and sent Marcus a text that was 3 words long. Marcus, across the floor, read it and looked up at Daniel with an expression that recalibrated several things simultaneously. "Done," she said. "What else?" Daniel picked up his canvas bag and set it on the workbench, not because he needed anything from it, but because it had been sitting on the floor, and he was a man who disliked objects being where they could be tripped over. I need you to stop looking at me like you're deciding whether to trust me. She held his gaze. I'm deciding exactly that. I know. Do it faster. He picked up the access log again. We have 5 hours. Something moved through her expression, not offense exactly, but the brief resistance of a person unaccustomed to being addressed without the buffer of hierarchy. Then it passed, and what replaced it was something closer to the expression she'd had when she read his file. A recalibration, quiet and genuine. She nodded once and went to find Preston Hale, to do the thing Daniel had told her not to do yet. Not confront him, but watch him, which was a different and more useful activity. The next 2 hours belonged to the work. Daniel moved through the Meridian's accessible systems with the systematic patience of a man who has been inside enough vessels to understand that they have personalities, that the logic of their construction reveals itself gradually and rewards attention. Marcus proved useful in the way that genuinely competent people prove useful when given permission to operate at their actual level. He knew the ship's history, the sequence of its construction, the decisions that had been made and revised and made again during 18 months of build. He and Daniel developed a working rhythm within 20 minutes, the kind that doesn't require much conversation, because the shared vocabulary of the work carries most of the necessary information. The engineering documents were spread across 2 workbenches by 10:45. Daniel stood in front of them with a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for. It had simply appeared on the corner of the bench, placed there by someone on the crew whose name he didn't know, an unremarkable gesture that carried the weight of small recognitions. The kind that don't require acknowledgement to land. He didn't look at the person who'd brought it, but he drank it. The original ballast configuration showed a system designed with 3 redundant monitoring points per chamber. The as-built drawings showed 2. The 3rd redundant sensor in Section 7C had been removed during a maintenance modification 8 months ago, approved by Preston Hale's office, attributed to a cost optimization review. Without that 3rd sensor, the monitoring system's anomaly threshold in that section was effectively doubled. An inverted valve could go undetected for twice as long before triggering an alert. Daniel circled it with a grease pencil, showed it to Marcus without comment. Marcus looked at it for a long time. That modification went through standard approval channels. I reviewed the documentation myself. It was... He stopped. It looked routine. It was meant to. Daniel set the pencil down. Someone was preparing this for a long time. He said it without inflection, but Marcus heard what was underneath it. Not just the planning this required, but the patience. The cold patience of someone who had decided on an outcome and was willing to spend months creating the conditions for it. That kind of patience was its own category of threat. At 11:20, Daniel found the second thing. It was not a device, it was an absence. A missing inspection stamp on a structural weld in the lower port bow section, a stamp that should have been applied during the final quality assurance walkthrough and wasn't. The weld itself was sound. He checked it twice. But the missing stamp meant the section had been excluded from the QA record, which meant it could be accessed and modified without triggering a discrepancy in the documentation. It was a door left unlocked. He photographed it with his phone and said nothing to Marcus yet. At 11:48, his phone rang again. He stepped away from the workbench into the relative quiet behind the pump housing. Lily's name was not on the screen this time. The contact read Frank, which was the entirety of how he had listed Rear Admiral Frank Caldwell in his phone for 23 years, because Frank Caldwell was the kind of person whose rank became irrelevant in the context of friendship, even when, especially when, The friendship had survived the kind of shared experience that tends to either cement or destroy such things. He answered, "I heard you had an interesting morning." Frank's voice was the particular voice of a man who has spent decades giving orders in difficult circumstances and has learned to keep amusement and concern in such careful balance that neither overwhelms the other. "Where did you hear that?" "I have friends at Newport News. Word travels." A pause. "You back on a floor?" "For the moment." "Daniel." Not a rebuke. Something quieter. "How long?" 7 years. The silence on Frank's end lasted 3 seconds and contained, Daniel knew, a great deal that Frank would not say directly, because Frank Caldwell was also a man who understood the precise value of certain silences. "Are you all right?" "I'm working," Daniel said, which was for him the same thing. "Lily?" "Good. She's good." He leaned against the pump housing and looked at the Meridian's hull, the long curve of it, the particular authority of something built to last. "Frank, I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Kevin Marsh, you still in contact with him?" Another silence, different quality. "Not since he left the program. 2 years ago, maybe 2.5. Why?" Daniel looked at the missing inspection stamp in his photograph. "No reason yet." "Daniel, I'll call you tonight." He ended the call and stood still for a moment with the phone in his hand, the way he had stood still after Lily's call, that 3-second interior pause that was not hesitation but something more like calibration. Then he put the phone away and went back to the workbenches. Marcus was waiting with a new printout. Overnight maintenance log. There's a 30-minute gap in the Section 7C record between midnight and 1 a.m., listed as a system update to the monitoring software. He handed it over. "The update isn't in the software changelog." Daniel read it. "Who signed off on the maintenance entry?" "Contractor badge." Marcus showed him the number. It was not Preston Hale's badge number. It was a different number entirely, one that Graham, when Daniel photographed it and sent it to Claire's phone with a 3-word message, "Run this badge," identified within 6 minutes as belonging to a contractor credential that had been issued 14 months ago to a subcontractor firm that had completed its work on the Meridian 8 months ago and whose site access should have been revoked at project completion. Should have been. Had not been. Claire appeared at the workbench 12 minutes later, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been adding numbers and has arrived at a sum she does not want to accept. She handed Daniel a printed sheet without speaking. He read it. The subcontractor credential had been kept active past its project end date by a standing authorization in Ashford Maritime's facilities management system. The authorization had been entered by Preston Hale's administrative account. Daniel set the sheet on the workbench next to the engineering documents and the access log and the photograph of the missing inspection stamp. These 4 pieces of paper that were beginning to form the outline of something whose full dimensions he could not yet see, but whose general shape was increasingly clear. "He's been planning this for over a year," Claire said. Not quite a question. At least. She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the yard continued its work. The cranes, the tools, the steady percussion of 200 men, building and maintaining things. The ordinary commerce of a place that existed to put ships on the water. In 4 hours and 12 minutes, 500 guests would arrive for a ceremony that had been arranged 6 months ago, that had been announced in trade publications and covered by 2 regional newspapers that represented the public face of Ashford Maritime's largest single contract in a decade. And somewhere in the architecture of that vessel, in the spaces between what had been documented and what had been done, something else was waiting. "Why?" she said. It was a genuine question, the kind that people ask when they need to understand the human logic of a betrayal rather than just its mechanics. Preston has been here 6 years. My father trusted him. Daniel thought about how to answer this without giving her more than she needed right now, because she needed to be operational, and the full answer to why had a way of pulling people into reflection at moments when reflection was a liability. Money, probably, or leverage. Sometimes both. He paused. Titan Marine has been trying to acquire your Gulf contracts for 3 years. A failed launch. A vessel that lists on its first day, in front of cameras, with 500 witnesses, does specific damage to specific relationships. The kind of damage that takes years to repair and sometimes doesn't. Claire looked at the Meridian. Her expression had the particular quality of someone seeing something they've built with great effort through the lens of someone else's attempt to destroy it. They would have taken it apart piece by piece. That was the plan. She turned back to him. Something had settled in her face. Not hardness, exactly, but resolution, the kind that arrives when a person stops arguing with a situation and begins responding to it on its own terms. What did we do? Before Daniel could answer, a sound came from the upper level of the dry dock. A single metallic impact, sharp and deliberate, like something heavy being set down with more force than necessary. Both of them looked up simultaneously. The upper maintenance walkway was empty. A wrench lay on the steel grating, still vibrating from the impact, 20 feet above them. Below the wrench, accessible through the maintenance hatch that the wrench had been positioned beside, was the secondary pump housing for the port ballast system. The same system Daniel had been examining 2 hours ago. He was moving before he consciously decided to. The maintenance ladder was 12 feet to his left, and he took it fast, the way men take ladders when they've done it for years, and the motion is stored below thought. Claire watched from below, her hand already on her phone. Marcus was halfway across the floor toward the base of the ladder, looking up. The upper walkway was empty by the time Daniel reached it. He stood at the top of the ladder and looked both directions. The walkway stretched 60 feet in each direction, connecting to stairwells at both ends. Both doors closed. A figure could have reached either stairwell in the 15 seconds it had taken him to climb. He crouched beside the wrench and looked at the maintenance hatch without touching it. The hatch was sealed, but it had been sealed recently. The locking lever was in the correct position, but the dust seal around the frame had been disturbed, a thin ring of displacement visible in the grime that accumulated in operational yards, the way it accumulates everywhere that work happens. The hatch had been opened and closed within the last few hours. He called down to Marcus, "Get me a flashlight and a pressure gauge." Then he called down to Claire, "You need to expand your security perimeter. Nobody on or off this floor without your direct authorization." She was already on the phone. He sat back on his heels on the upper walkway and looked out through the yard's high windows at the strip of Virginia sky visible above the roofline, pale blue going toward noon. The sun was somewhere behind a thin overcast, diffuse and directionless, providing light without shadows. He thought about the missing inspection stamp. He thought about the contractor credential kept active past its expiration. He thought about Kevin Marsh and the particular torque signature in the Section 7C valve inversion, and the way that signature had pulled at something in the back of his mind since the moment he saw it, a recognition he had been declining to complete. Kevin Marsh had graduated from Annapolis in 2014. Daniel had run the structural engineering seminars for the civilian attachment program for 6 of the 7 years he'd been at Newport News before his resignation. Marsh had been in the second cohort. Sharp, technically gifted, with a particular intuition for load distribution problems that Daniel had noted in his evaluation as exceptional. He had written Marsh a letter of recommendation for his first major contract position. He had not heard from him in 2 years. The flashlight arrived. Daniel opened the maintenance hatch and looked inside. The secondary pump housing was intact. No device. No modification. Whatever had been done here, if anything had been done here, was not visible to a flashlight inspection from the access point. He checked the pressure gauge connections, the sensor leads, the junction box at the rear of the housing. Everything appeared nominal. He closed the hatch and sat for a moment with the flashlight in his hand. The wrench on the walkway grating had not fallen. There was no mechanism by which an unsecured wrench could have landed in that precise position. Vertically oriented, centered on the grating, its impact loud enough to carry to the floor below. Through accident. It had been placed. A deliberate sound at a deliberate moment. Whoever was in this yard had wanted him to come up here. The question was whether they had wanted him up here to find something or to keep him away from something else. He stood up and looked down at the floor below, where Marcus was waiting at the base of the ladder and the crew had resumed its work, and Claire was standing near the main workbench with her phone to her ear and her back straight, and her free hand on the edge of the bench in the posture of someone holding themselves very still, because stillness is the only form of control currently available to them. Preston Hale was no longer visible on the far side of the yard. Daniel scanned the entire floor from the elevated position that the walkway provided. Preston Hale was not on the floor. He looked at every cluster of people, every doorway, every section of the hull accessible from the yard level. The board members who had been with Preston were now talking to Claire's head of operations near the east entrance. The cluster that Preston had occupied was dispersed, its members redistributed into the general movement of the morning, and Preston himself was simply gone. Not dramatically absent, not in a way that would have registered if Daniel hadn't been looking, but absent in the specific way of a man who has made a calculation and acted on it. He came down the ladder fast. "Where's Hale?" he said to Marcus. Marcus looked around. He stepped out, maybe 10 minutes ago. I thought he went to the conference trailer. Daniel looked at Claire, who had ended her call and was watching him with the attention of someone reading weather. He said it quietly enough that only she heard. "Check the conference trailer. Check his office. Check the parking lot." A pause. "Check the Section 7C maintenance corridor." She held his gaze for 1 second, then turned and gave instructions to 2 of her security team in the low, clear voice of a woman who has learned that urgency is more effective than volume. Daniel walked back to the workbench. He stood in front of the 4 pieces of paper, the access log, the engineering documents, the maintenance log gap, the photograph of the missing inspection stamp, and looked at them in the way you look at a problem when you know you have most of its components and are waiting for the last one to arrive. His phone showed 12:31 p.m., 3 hours and 29 minutes to the launch ceremony. He thought about Lily, who would be in math class now, probably finished with the keel ratio problem and on to something else. He thought about the 1987 truck in the parking lot and the drive home through Newport at the end of a day that had already exceeded every expectation he'd had when he walked through the yard gate this morning. He thought about the promise he'd made about being home before 8, and the insulin kit on the kitchen counter, and the drawings on the refrigerator, The ships Lily drew in the specific way of someone who grew up hearing about them, stylized and structurally inaccurate in the hull lines, but somehow capturing the right feeling. He thought about the fact that someone in this yard had been planning, for over a year, to put a $240 million ship on the bottom of the dock in front of 500 witnesses, and that the specific technical knowledge required to do it, to choose Section 7C, to know the monitoring threshold, to remove the redundant sensor 8 months in advance, was knowledge that traced back through a lineage of training and trust to him. He picked up the grease pencil. He drew a second circle on the access log beside the first one and connected them with a line. Then he stood back and looked at what he had. 2 entry points, 1 night, 1 objective, 2 people, at minimum, who knew enough to execute it. He was still looking at it when Claire returned. Her expression told him before she spoke. "Preston's car is gone from the lot," she said. "His office is locked. He's not answering his phone." Daniel nodded slowly. "He ran," she said. The word carried a specific kind of anger, not heat, but pressure, the kind that builds in enclosed spaces. "He ran," Daniel agreed, "which means he knows we found the footage." He looked at her. Someone told him. The yard moved around them, ordinary and unaware, the cranes and the tools and the 200 men doing the work of building things that were meant to last. The Meridian sat in her dock, level and monitored and carrying somewhere in her structure at least one secret that Daniel had not yet found. 3 hours and 21 minutes. The yard's rhythm had not changed. Cranes still moved overhead in their slow arcs. Welding torches still threw brief white light against the Meridian's hull in irregular intervals, like a pulse. Men called to each other across the floor in the shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to compress entire instructions into 2 or 3 words. From the outside, from the walkway or the conference trailer windows, or the perspective of anyone who did not know what the last 4 hours had contained, Newport Maritime Yard looked like a facility executing a normal pre-launch Tuesday. Daniel found this more troubling than reassuring. He took the 4 pieces of paper from the workbench and folded them into his jacket pocket. Then he walked to the far end of the porthole where the noise from the crane operation provided enough cover for a conversation that didn't need to be overheard. And he stood there and thought with the particular discipline of a man who had learned, over many years and in circumstances considerably less forgiving than this one, that the first story a situation tells you is almost never the complete story. The first story here was Preston Hale, CFO with inside access, financial motive, a year of preparation, and a contractor credential left active past its expiration date like a key under the mat. It was a clean story. It had documentation. It had security footage. It had a car no longer in the parking lot. Daniel had spent 20 years designing systems that failed safely. The principle was simple. You never built a structure whose failure depended on a single point of intervention holding. You assumed the worst case. You designed for it. You built redundancy not because you expected failure, but because expectation was not the point. The point was that failure, when it came, arrived in the shape you had least anticipated. Preston Hale was the shape they had anticipated. He went back to Marcus. "The Section 7C valve inversion," he said. "Walk me through the torque sequence you used to correct it." Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man being asked to retrace a path he'd already walked. "You talked me through it. Counterclockwise reset, then primary torque." "Which way did you turn the primary torque fitting?" "Clockwise. Standard orientation for this valve housing configuration." And the resistance on the fitting when you first engaged it? Marcus paused. The kind of pause that means something is being reconsidered rather than recalled. It was lower than I expected. For a valve that had been inverted under load, I would have expected more resistance. The fitting turned easily. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Outside the high windows, a gull crossed the strip of sky, moving southeast toward open water. The valve wasn't inverted under load, he said. It was inverted after the ballast system was depressurized. Someone opened the system, made the modification, and repressurized it. That's a two-person operation, minimum. One person at the valve, one person at the pressure control station. Marcus absorbed this, which means Preston Hale had help, someone who was still here this morning. The word still did its work in the silence that followed. Daniel looked across the floor. The crew of 200 were people he had worked beside for 7 years, without asking their names mostly, or telling them his, existing in that particular social contract of blue-collar proximity, where what you could do mattered considerably more than what you were called. He knew their hands. He knew their habits. He knew which men took their lunch breaks early and which ones stayed on the floor until the foreman told them twice to go, and which ones moved through the yard with a specific kind of purposeful efficiency that distinguished genuine competence from the performance of it. He knew this floor the way he knew the inside of a pressure hull, not because he had studied it, but because he had lived in it, day by day, in the accumulated intelligence of 7 years of presence. He began walking, not quickly, not with the deliberate projection of someone following a lead. He moved through the floor the way he always moved through it, at the measured pace of a man who belongs where he is and has nowhere urgent to be. Stopping at a junction box near the midship section, crouching to examine a cable housing, standing and moving on. Watching. At the aft section of the porthull, near the access ladder to the lower maintenance deck, a man named Briggs, not the retired floor supervisor, but a rigger named Tom Briggs, who had been on the floor for 3 years, was securing a cable run with the attentiveness of someone concentrating slightly too hard on a simple task. Daniel had seen the same quality of over-attention in officers during inspections. The focus of a person managing their own behavior rather than doing the work. He stopped beside Briggs, looked at the cable run. "That junction's misrouted," he said. "It should run under the bracket, not over." Briggs looked at it. "I've been doing it this way since..." "Since who told you to?" Daniel said it without looking at him, in the same tone he'd used all morning. Not accusatory, just informational. The voice of a man asking a question to which he already has a partial answer and is waiting to see if the full answer matches. Briggs said nothing, which was, in its own way, an answer. Daniel crouched and began rerouting the cable properly, hands moving through the task with the automatic competence of someone for whom this kind of work was as natural as breathing. While his hands worked, he kept his voice low and level and entirely conversational. "You were at the pressure control station last night." Briggs's breathing changed, not dramatically. The small change of a man whose body responds before his decision-making can stop it. "I'm not a threat to you," Daniel said. He finished routing the cable and secured the junction, stood up. "But in about 2 hours, this yard is going to have federal investigators on the floor. And the difference between a man who made a bad decision under pressure and a man who obstructed an investigation is about 30 minutes of conversation." He looked at Briggs directly for the first time. "Preston Hale is gone. He took his car and his phone and left you here." Briggs looked at the cable junction. He was a man in his mid-30s with the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors and the expression of someone calculating a cost he had not expected to arrive this quickly. "I didn't know what he was planning," he said. "He told me it was a pressure test, an unauthorized test that needed to be off the books. He said it was to check a design flaw before the launch, that the official inspection had missed something, and he needed to verify it without going through channels because it would delay the launch by a week." "And you believed him?" A long pause. "He paid me $4,000. Daniel looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not contempt and not sympathy, but something in the middle. The recognition of a man who understood how decisions like this happened, the specific confluence of financial pressure and plausible framing, and the human tendency to accept explanations that allow you to do what you've already decided to do. Tell Claire Ashford everything you just told me. Tell her now, before the federal people arrive. That's the only version of this morning that helps you." He walked away without waiting for a response. Claire was at the main workbench when he reached her, on her phone. The expression of managed pressure that had been on her face since 9 a.m. now carrying an additional layer that came from too much information arriving too fast. She ended the call as he approached. He told her about Briggs in 4 sentences. She listened with the stillness of someone absorbing a significant recalibration, then called her head of security and gave instructions in a voice that had no excess in it. When she turned back to Daniel, something had shifted in the quality of her attention. It was the shift that happened when a person stopped processing you as a variable and started processing you as a partner, which were different things that required different postures. And the transition between them, when it was genuine, was visible in the eyes before it reached the rest of the face. "You knew there was someone else on the floor?" she said. "I thought there probably was. How long have you known?" "Long enough." He looked at the meridian. "The valve inversion told me. The question was whether you wanted the information that way or the clean way." She looked at him for a long moment. "There isn't a clean way." "No," he agreed. "There rarely is." He picked up the grease pencil from the workbench and added a 3rd circle to the access log, connected it to the 2nd. 3 points, 1 line, the shape of something that was not yet finished. "But now we know who was in the yard. We know what they did. And we know that Preston Hale is somewhere in Virginia with a phone he's not answering." He set the pencil down. 2 hours and 50 minutes to the launch. Claire looked at the meridian, at the 3 circles on the access log, at the 4 pieces of paper that had accumulated across the morning into something that resembled a case. "What are we still missing?" Daniel thought about the missing inspection stamp, about the maintenance hatch on the upper walkway, about the deliberate sound of a wrench placed on steel grating to pull him away from the floor at a specific moment, about the shape of the thing he could see most of and not yet all of. "I don't know yet," he said, "but it's in the hull." The federal investigators arrived at 1:14 p.m. in 2 unmarked sedans and a van with government plates, and they brought with them the particular institutional energy of people who have been briefed on an incident and are now here to convert it into a process. The lead agent was a woman named Reeves, compact, unhurried, with the kind of face that gave nothing away without conscious effort and had clearly been giving nothing away for long enough that it had become the default. She shook Claire's hand, declined coffee, and asked to see the security footage from Checkpoint 3. Daniel watched this from the workbench where he was still working, which was where he had been when the sedans pulled in and where he intended to remain, because the arrival of federal investigators was not his problem to manage, and the thing he had not yet found in the Meridian's hull very much was. He had 2 hours and 46 minutes before the launch ceremony. The investigators would require some portion of that time from Claire, and Claire would give it to them competently, and in the meantime, the yard would continue its preparation, and the hull would continue to hold its secret, and Daniel would continue looking. He was in the access corridor beneath the port bow section when Graham found him. Graham was out of breath in the way of someone who had climbed one ladder too many in dress shoes, and he held his tablet with both hands the way he held it when the information on it was the kind that needed to be delivered carefully. "Ms. Ashford said to find you immediately." He turned the tablet. The screen showed a news alert. The timestamp was 11 minutes ago. The headline read, "Sabotage Claim. Whistleblower alleges Ashford Maritime knowingly concealed structural defects in USS Meridian." Below it, a photograph, Daniel, taken from a distance in the yard, crouching beside the Section 7C access panel. The photograph was time-stamped 9:07 a.m., which placed it within 20 minutes of his return to the floor. Below the photograph, a quote attributed to an anonymous source. "The individual in the image is a former Navy contractor with a history of unauthorized modifications to government vessels. He was dismissed this morning and returned to the facility under unclear circumstances." Daniel read it twice. Then he handed the tablet back to Graham. "Tell Ms. Ashford I've seen it." "She wants to know." "Tell her I've seen it and I'm still working." He turned back to the access corridor. "That's what she needs right now. Someone still working." Graham hesitated with the particular hesitation of a young man caught between two forms of authority and trying to determine which one to disappoint. Then he went back the way he came. Daniel looked at the lower bow section. He thought about who had taken that photograph at 9:07 a.m. in the specific position and angle that showed his face clearly while obscuring the access panel behind him. The deliberate framing of an image intended to tell a story that was adjacent to the truth without being true. He thought about the 11-minute timestamp between the article posting and Graham's arrival, which meant the article had gone up while the investigators were still parking their vehicles, which meant the timing was not coincidental. Preston Hale had not simply run. He had been running a second operation in parallel, not improvised in response to being caught, but prepared in advance, ready to deploy at the moment the first operation was exposed. The video footage, the anonymous quote, the photograph taken this morning. These required preparation that predated today. The story about Daniel had been written before Daniel returned to the floor, which meant Preston Hale had known, or strongly suspected, that the valve inversion would be identified, had planned for the possibility of exposure, had built a secondary narrative to contain the damage and redirect the investigation. Daniel had spent 20 years designing redundant systems. He recognized one when he saw it. He went back to the hull. The missing inspection stamp was in Section 11B, lower port bow, and the weld it should have certified was sound. He had confirmed that twice. But the reason for the missing stamp was not quality concealment. He understood now. It was access documentation. A weld without a stamp existed in the official record in a state of ambiguity, neither certified nor flagged, simply absent, which meant any inspection of that section would require re-examination from the beginning rather than verification of existing work. It was a way of creating a legitimate reason to bring someone back to that specific location without triggering questions about why they needed to be there. Someone needed to return to Section 11B. He looked at the weld, then at the surrounding structure, then, methodically, at every accessible surface within a 6-foot radius of the unstamped joint, running his hands along steel that had been dark and cold and undisturbed since the last maintenance cycle. His fingers found it on the third pass. It was behind the secondary frame bracket, in the narrow gap between the bracket and the hull plating. An object roughly the size of a hardcover book, wrapped in waterproof material and secured with 2 industrial magnets to the inner surface of the hull. It was not a complex device. It was not meant to be. The components were straightforward, the assembly competent, and the placement deliberate. Far enough from the ballast system to avoid detection during a ballast-focused inspection, close enough to the fuel line junction at Section 12A to produce a specific outcome if it reached its activation threshold. Daniel did not touch it. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. The flashlight beam steady in his hand, his breathing even in the contained space of the access corridor. He had seen devices like this before, not in shipyards, but in other contexts in a period of his life that he had put away with the same deliberateness with which he had put away his professional credentials, his patents, his rank, his name in the institutional records that now showed only personal where an explanation should have been. The assembly was not military specification, but the knowledge behind it was. He photographed it 4 times from different angles. Then he backed out of the corridor slowly, the way you back out of spaces that contain things you have decided not to disturb, and sat on the maintenance deck floor for a moment with his back against the hull and the flashlight pointing at the ceiling and his phone in his hand. He called Claire. She answered in 2 rings. He could hear Reeves's voice in the background and the particular acoustic quality of the conference trailer. "I need you to come to Section 11B access corridor," he said. "Alone. Don't bring the investigators yet." A pause. "Don't bring anyone yet." "Daniel." 2 minutes. He ended the call. She arrived in 90 seconds, which told him she had been moving toward him before she finished the call, which told him something about where her instincts were now relative to where they had been at 8 o'clock this morning. She came down the access ladder with more confidence than she'd had on any ladder this morning. The heels had been exchanged somewhere in the last hour for flat work boots from the equipment locker, a practical adjustment that nobody had mentioned, and that said something about her capacity for adaptation. He showed her the photograph on his phone without speaking. She looked at it for 10 seconds. Then she looked at him. "How long has it been there?" "Based on the dust pattern, at least a week, maybe 2. "Before the overnight access?" "Significantly before." He put the phone in his pocket. "The valve inversion this morning was a distraction. It was designed to be found, maybe not immediately, but during the launch preparation. Something to create chaos, pull attention to the ballast system, give Preston a reason to be involved in the response." He looked at the hull above them. "The device is the objective. The valve was noise." Claire sat down on the maintenance deck floor, not elegantly, just sat, with the abrupt decision of a person whose legs have received a signal from the rest of their body. She sat and looked at the access corridor opening for a long moment, and Daniel let the silence be what it was, because some information needed a moment before it became actionable. 500 people, she said. "Yes." "This afternoon?" "Yes." She looked at her hands, then at the corridor, then up at him with the expression of someone who has completed a calculation and is now living in its result. "Why didn't you tell the investigators first?" The question was genuine, and it deserved a genuine answer. Because I needed you to understand the full picture before Reeves does, he said. Once the FBI takes this, they take everything. The yard, the launch, the timeline, all of it. Your decisions stop being yours to make. There are things you need to decide in the next 5 minutes that you won't have the option to decide in 6 minutes. She held his gaze. What things? Whether you cancel the launch. A pause. Is that what you do? He considered it honestly, the way he considered things he was asked directly. The device can be rendered safe, he said. I can do it. Not quickly, but in the time we have, yes. If it's done correctly, the launch is not a risk. If it's done incorrectly, or if there's a component I haven't identified, then 500 people are standing at the wrong end of a fuel line junction when something goes wrong. He paused. That's not a calculation I can make for you. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the hull, the yard sounds were continuous and ordinary. Cranes, tools, voices, the specific industrial music of a facility doing what it was built to do. Somewhere above them, 200 men were preparing a ship for a launch that was either going to happen or not happen, and they didn't know yet which it would be. Then Daniel's phone rang. The contact said, Mrs. Garrett, and his body understood before his mind processed it. A single tightening across the chest, the involuntary recalibration of a parent receiving an unexpected call from his daughter's caregiver in the middle of a workday. He answered. Mrs. Garrett's voice had the specific quality of controlled alarm, a woman trying to be calm because she understood that calm was needed and finding it difficult. Mr. Rowe, I'm at the hospital with Lily. She started showing symptoms about an hour ago. She seemed fine this morning, but her levels dropped very fast. The doctors say it's ketoacidosis. She's stable, but they want to keep her overnight, and they're asking if you... I'm on my way, he said. She's asking for you. She's okay. She's talking, but she wants... Tell her I'm coming. He ended the call. He stood still for 3 seconds. Not paralyzed. Daniel Rowe did not do paralysis, but occupying the precise moment between receiving information and acting on it, the highway running straight toward the city, the afternoon traffic moving at its ordinary pace. He had made this drive 100 times. It had never felt this long. Claire was watching him. She had heard enough. Go, she said. The device. Tell me how to photograph the remaining components. Tell me what to give Reeves. I'll handle the rest. He looked at her. The woman who had fired him in front of 200 people 9 hours ago was now sitting on a maintenance deck floor in borrowed work boots, asking him to trust her with a problem that had the potential to end her company, her career, and the lives of 500 people she had invited to a party. She was asking him calmly. She was asking him as someone who had, over the course of a very long Tuesday, earned the right to be asked. He handed her the flashlight. He told her exactly what to photograph and in what order, and what to tell Reeves and what not to tell her yet. He told her the device was stable, that it had not been armed. The arming mechanism required a separate trigger that had not yet been attached, which was the only reason the overnight visit and the week-old placement could coexist without incident. He told her this with the specific confidence of a man who had looked at the device long enough to understand it, not because he was certain, but because certainty in these contexts was a luxury you rarely had and competence was what you substituted for it. She listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, she said, Will she be all right? He picked up his canvas bag. She always has been. He looked at Claire for a moment with the particular look of a man revising an assessment he made at 8 o'clock this morning, finding the current version considerably more accurate. Don't let Reeves make the call on the launch. That's yours. He climbed the ladder. The yard floor was bright after the maintenance corridor, the afternoon light coming through the high windows at an angle that picked up the dust in the air and the arc of the crane cables and the particular quality of a space where serious work was happening. He walked through it without hurrying, past Marcus, who looked up from a schematic and registered something in Daniel's face and said nothing. Past the crew at midship, past the cluster of federal personnel near the east entrance who watched him cross the floor with the attention of people cataloging movement, past the security station at the interior checkpoint where the guard this afternoon was paying considerably more attention than the one this morning had been. He pushed through the exterior door into the Virginia afternoon. The light outside was different from the light inside, broader, without the sodium tinge of the yard's overhead fixtures, carrying the salt and fuel smell of a working harbor and the particular quality of a day that had been going on for a long time without resolution. His truck was where he'd left it, oldest vehicle in the lot by a considerable margin, a 1987 Ford F-150, the color of faded rust that started on the second turn of the key, because he maintained it with the same philosophy he applied to everything mechanical: correct diagnosis, appropriate intervention, regular attention. It did not need to be new to be reliable. It needed to be understood. He was on Route 60, heading toward the hospital, when his phone rang again. The contact said, "Frank." He answered on speaker. "I know about Lily," Frank said immediately. And the fact that he knew that someone had called him, that the network of care around his daughter had activated without Daniel's direction, produced a feeling in Daniel's chest that was too complicated to examine while driving. "She's stable. I'm already at the hospital. I got here 20 minutes ago. You're at the hospital. I told you this morning I'd handle it." A pause that contained the dignity of a man who does not require acknowledgement for doing what he said he would do. "She's asking for you. She's also asking whether the keel ratio answer in her book is actually wrong, so she's fine." Daniel exhaled. Something released in his chest that had been held since Mrs. Garrett's call, since the 3-second pause on the maintenance deck floor, since this morning when Lily had said, "I'm fine." Dad in the tone of an 11-year-old who has been managing her own medical reality long enough to treat it as simply part of being alive. "Frank," he said. "Yeah?" "I need to tell you something. Kevin Marsh." A silence on Frank's end that was not the easy silence of their earlier conversation. This one had weight. "I found a device in the hull," Daniel said. "The placement, the assembly. It's a methodology I've seen before. In my program at Annapolis, second cohort, 2013. The silence extended. "Frank." "I heard you." Frank's voice had changed, not in volume, but in texture, the quality that appeared when he was processing something he had hoped was not true. Kevin left the program under circumstances that there were financial issues. I didn't know the extent. I should have followed up. You couldn't have known. I should have followed up. He said it with the finality of a man accepting accountability for something that had already happened and could not be revised. "Does Ashford know?" "Not yet, not with certainty." Daniel signaled his exit. The hospital tower was visible on the horizon, its upper floors catching the afternoon light. Whatever Kevin's involvement is, it goes through Preston Hale. Hale had the access, the authority, the financial motive. Kevin had the knowledge. He paused. Someone compromised him. Debt, leverage, something. He's not... He stopped. Thought about the torque signature in Section 7C. The precise, competent, recognizable fingerprint of a man Daniel had trained with care and some pride in the specific belief that teaching someone to do something well was one of the few genuinely useful contributions available to a person in a limited life. He's not a bad person who made a bad plan. He's a good person who made a catastrophic decision, probably because someone understood exactly what kind of pressure would make him. That's a generous read. It's an accurate read. The hospital exit. I taught him. I know how he thinks. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? Daniel pulled into the hospital parking structure, found a space on the second level, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence of a vehicle that had carried him through 7 years of unremarkable mornings and one Tuesday that would require considerably more time to fully understand. "Stay with Lily until I get there," he said. "And Frank, don't tell her anything about today yet." "She's 11, Daniel. She already knows something happened." "I know." He opened the door. "I just want to tell her myself." He crossed the parking structure toward the elevator with his canvas bag over his shoulder and his welding gloves folded in his jacket pocket where they had been since he removed them in the yard this morning. And somewhere behind him, back at Newport Maritime Yard, a woman who had fired him 9 hours ago was sitting on a maintenance deck floor with a flashlight and a phone, and the specific knowledge that the next decision she made was entirely hers to make, which was either a burden or a freedom depending on who you were. And Claire Ashford, Daniel had come to understand over the course of a very long Tuesday, was a person for whom those two things had always been the same. The elevator doors opened. He was 2 miles from the hospital exit when Reeves called. He had not given her his number. Claire had. That told him something about the conversation that had happened in the maintenance corridor after he left, and about the kind of decision Claire had made regarding what information belonged to whom. Reeves's voice carried the specific economy of someone who did not have time for social architecture. "Ms. Ashford says you know the device. I've seen the assembly. I know the methodology. We have an EOD team 20 minutes out. In the interim, I need you to walk my agent through a preliminary assessment, non-contact, eyes only." A pause that was not hesitation but evaluation. "Ms. Ashford says you're the most qualified person within 50 miles to do this." Daniel signaled the highway exit and kept driving. "Put your agent on." The agent's name was Sorensen. He was in the Section 11B corridor with a flashlight and a radio, and the controlled calm of someone trained for exactly this situation who was nonetheless grateful for additional information. Daniel talked him through it from the parking structure elevator, walking and speaking simultaneously, the phone pressed to his ear and his mind back inside the hull he had memorized over 7 years of working beside it. He described the bracket position, the magnet placement, the gap between the waterproof wrapping and the frame, the specific way the assembly sat against the hull plating, slightly angled, not flush, which told him something about the hand that had placed it and confirmed what he already suspected about its origin. He told Sorensen where to look for the arming component and why it almost certainly was not present. He explained the reasoning. The device had been placed too early, before the final launch preparation window, which meant the person who placed it had planned to return. The overnight visit had not been the placement. It had been the preparation for a second visit that had not happened because Preston Hale had run before he could make it. "Arming component is not present," Sorensen confirmed. "Device is inert." Check the junction box at the rear of the housing before you touch anything else, Daniel said. If there's a secondary trigger, it'll be there. 40 seconds of silence. Clear, Sorensen said. Daniel stepped out of the elevator into the parking structure's second level. His truck was where he'd left it. The afternoon had continued without him, Virginia going about its business, and the harbor was visible in the gap between two hospital buildings, a strip of dark water catching the last of the light. Mr. Rowe, Reeves had come back on the line. The launch. That's Miss Ashford's call, he said. Not mine, not yours. A pause. Then, with something that was not quite approval, but lived near it. Understood. He ended the call, got in the truck, drove the last 2 miles to the hospital entrance, thinking about Lily, and about the drawing on the bedside table, and about the specific wait of a day that had required everything he had and had taken it without apology, which was, he thought, the only kind of day worth having. He went to find his daughter. Lily was in room 412, and she was arguing with a nurse about whether her blood glucose monitor was calibrated correctly when Daniel walked through the door. She stopped arguing immediately. Not because she had lost the argument, her expression suggested she believed she had not, but because he was there, and the thing that happened in her face when he walked into a room had been happening since she was 4 years old, and had never required explanation from either of them. She was small in the hospital bed in the way that children are small in institutional furniture, reduced to their essential dimensions by the scale of things designed for adults. But her eyes were the eyes of someone who had been paying attention all day and had formed several conclusions she intended to share. Frank Caldwell was in the chair beside the bed, a large man made larger by the smallness of the room, in civilian clothes rather than uniform, but carrying his rank and his posture the way men who have worn it long enough always do. He stood when Daniel entered, the brief stand of acknowledgement between people who have known each other through worse rooms than this one, and then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and moved toward the door. "I'll be in the hall," Frank said. His hand landed briefly on Daniel's shoulder as he passed. Not a grip, just contact, the tactile shorthand of 23 years. Then he was gone. Daniel set his canvas bag on the floor beside the chair and sat down. He looked at Lily for a moment, at the monitor leads and the IV line and the hospital bracelet on her narrow wrist, and the way she was looking at him with the particular combination of relief and mild indignation that she deployed when she had been frightened and was not going to admit it. "Your levels," he said, "are fine now. They overcorrected my insulin this morning. The formula I've been using was slightly wrong. The ratio changes when I grow and nobody updated it." She said this with the precision of someone who had already interrogated the medical staff thoroughly and arrived at a satisfactory technical explanation. "It wasn't my fault." "I know." Mrs. Garrett panicked. "She did the right thing." Lily looked at him, then at the canvas bag, then at his jacket, where the outline of his welding gloves was visible in the pocket. She had her mother's eyes, not the color, which was Daniel's gray, but the quality of them, the way they moved through a room collecting information with the quiet efficiency of instruments doing what they were designed to do. "Something happened today," she said. "Yes." "Something big." "Yes." She accepted this with the seriousness it deserved, not pressing for details she understood he would give her when he was ready to give them. This was a negotiation they had developed over years, her curiosity and his privacy finding a working arrangement based on mutual respect rather than parental authority. because Lily had never responded well to authority without reason, and Daniel had never had much patience for offering it. "Admiral Caldwell came," she said. "He brought terrible cafeteria coffee and we played cards, and he told me about the time you two got a submarine stuck in a sandbar in Chesapeake Bay." That story is classified. He seemed to think the statute of limitations had expired. Daniel looked at her for a long moment with the expression that appeared on his face only in this room, in this specific configuration. His daughter in front of him, alive and complicated, and entirely herself, carrying in her face and her manner and her particular way of being in the world the accumulated presence of a woman who had not lived long enough and a man who was doing his best with the years he had. "How do you feel?" "Tired, better than an hour ago." She looked at her hands. "Dad, the keel ratio." 0.47, he said. "You were right. The book is wrong." She nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose conclusion has been confirmed by a reliable source. Then quietly, without looking up, "Were you scared today?" He thought about the honest answer, which was the only kind of answer he gave her. "There were moments, but you did it anyway. That's generally how it works." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Virginia afternoon was doing what Virginia afternoons did in late season. Cooling faster than the morning had suggested it would, the light going amber at the edges, the kind of evening that arrived like a concession. "Mom would say that's the definition of courage," Lily said. "Not the absence of fear, the decision that something else matters more." Daniel looked at his daughter, at the 11-year-old who had grown up in the specific climate of a house where grief was present but not dominant, where a dead woman's voice lived in photographs and books, and the particular way her daughter tilted her head when she was thinking. And he felt, as he sometimes felt in these moments, that Sarah had not entirely left so much as redistributed, becoming less a person and more a quality that persisted in everything she had touched. He reached over and held her hand. She let him. They sat like that for a while, in the ordinary silence of a hospital room on an extraordinary Tuesday. And outside in the hall, Frank Caldwell drank his terrible coffee and pretended not to be standing guard, and the afternoon continued its patient work of becoming evening. His phone rang at 4:17. Claire's voice was different from the voice she'd had in the maintenance corridor. Not calmer. She had been calm there too. The specific calm of a person managing crisis through containment. This was something else. A quality of precision that arrived in people when they had made a decision and were executing it without remainder. "Reeves cleared the device 40 minutes ago," she said. "Her people found the arming component in Preston's office. It was never brought to the yard. The device was never operational." Daniel absorbed this. The launch. Proceeds, 2 hours. A pause. "I made the call." He looked at Lily, who had fallen asleep with her hand still loosely in his, her breathing the even breathing of someone whose body had been working hard all day and had finally been given permission to rest. "How's the yard?" "Functioning. Reeves has Preston in custody in Richmond. He drove to his brother's house, which was apparently not the escape plan he thought it was." Another pause, shorter. "Kevin Marsh turned himself in an hour ago. He walked into the Newport News FBI field office with his lawyer. His statement corroborates everything we found. Preston approached him 8 months ago, exploited a debt situation, provided the contractor credential and access to the engineering documents." Daniel said nothing. "He asked if you knew," Claire said. "Marsh. He asked specifically if you knew it was him." What did you tell him? That I didn't know what you knew. A beat. Did you? I suspected. He looked at his daughter's face in sleep, the slight frown she always carried, even unconscious, as though her mind never fully stood down. I hoped I was wrong. The silence on the line had the quality of someone receiving an answer they understand but find insufficient, which was fair, because it was insufficient. Some things were not fully explainable and did not become so with additional words. Daniel. Her voice had shifted again into the register she used when she was saying something she had prepared and was now delivering regardless of how it landed. The board is here. Reeves has briefed them on the investigation. They know what you did. This morning. The valve. The device. All of it. A pause that had weight in it. Ashby wants to speak with you. Tonight. After the launch. I'll be there. He ended the call. Frank appeared in the doorway, his large frame filling it with the unhurried presence of a man who has learned to occupy space without imposing it. He looked at Lily sleeping, then at Daniel. She's going to be fine, he said. Not reassurance, statement of fact, delivered with the authority of someone who had been paying attention. I know. Daniel stood slowly, the way he stood after extended periods in confined spaces, the knees registering their complaint and being noted and overruled. He looked at Frank. She turned herself in. I heard. Preston's in custody. I heard that too. Frank moved to the window, looked out at the harbor visible in the distance, the water going dark gold in the afternoon light, the shapes of vessels at the commercial piers, the far line of the Atlantic suggesting itself beyond the harbor mouth. What happens now? Daniel picked up his canvas bag, set it down again, looked at his daughter, at the monitor showing her levels steady and correcting, at the hospital bracelet on her wrist, at the drawing she had apparently produced at some point in the afternoon. A ship, structurally inaccurate in the hull lines, but capturing something essential, folded on the bedside table next to Frank's terrible cafeteria coffee. Now I go back, he said. Frank turned from the window. To the yard. To the yard! A long look between them. The look of two men who have known each other long enough to have entire conversations in the duration of eye contact, who have shared the specific compound of grief and duty and difficult decisions that tends to either destroy friendships or make them indestructible. Frank's expression carried something that was not quite pride, because it was more complicated than pride. The particular feeling of watching a person you care about do the thing that costs them most, and costs them willingly. She'll sleep for a few hours, Frank said. I'll be here when she wakes up. Daniel nodded. He took the drawing from the bedside table, the ship with the wrong hull lines, and folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket beside the welding gloves. Then he bent and kissed his daughter's forehead with the precise tenderness of a man who does not perform tenderness, but simply has it. In the way that some men have things they have never needed to examine because they have never considered the possibility of their absence. He went back to the yard. The launch ceremony had been reorganized in the 2 hours since Reeves's team had cleared the hull, and the reorganization had the quality of a production that had absorbed a significant complication and was proceeding anyway because the alternative was worse. The guests were arriving. The 500 people in their best clothes filing through the decorated entrance of Newport Maritime Yard with the cheerful ignorance of people attending an event whose backstory they did not know and would learn about later in news coverage they would discuss with the specific excitement of people who were there without being there. Daniel came in through the workers' entrance. The floor was transformed, or rather, overlaid, the operational reality of the yard still present beneath the ceremony's additions, the cranes still in position, the workstations still occupied by crew members who were simultaneously employees and attendees, men in their work clothes standing at the margins of an event happening in the space where they spent their days. The Meridian was lit, exterior lights running along her hull line, the dry dock flooded and gleaming, the vessel looking exactly like the $240 million she represented. And nothing at all like the object that had contained, 6 hours ago, a device in a waterproof wrapping secured by industrial magnets. Marcus found him near the starboard side. "I want to show you something," Marcus said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has been sitting with information all afternoon and has decided how to deliver it. He led Daniel to the Section 7C access panel, the site of the morning's first crisis, the place where the day had properly begun, and crouched beside it. He had re-stamped the missing inspection certification Daniel saw. The weld, Section 11B. Everything documented correctly, the record made whole. "I did the full QA walkthrough myself this afternoon," Marcus said. "Every section, every stamp. 4 hours." He looked up. "She's clean. Everything that was done to her has been undone or documented. She's ready." Daniel looked at the panel for a moment. Then at Marcus, who had the expression of a man offering something. Not just information, but the work behind it. The 4 hours of deliberate correction. The making good of something that had been compromised. It was the kind of offering that didn't require acknowledgement, but deserved it. "Good work," Daniel said. Marcus stood, started to say something, stopped, then said it. "I've been doing this for 15 years. The way you read that tilt this morning, in 10 seconds, from 30 feet away. I've never seen anything like it." He paused. "I looked up your patents this afternoon. The pressure distribution work, the Virginia-class load analysis." Another pause. "I don't understand how you've been here 7 years." Daniel looked at the Meridian, at the lights on her hull and the dark water in the flooded dock and the 500 people assembling on the observation platform above, at the 200 men distributed around the margins of the event, present in the way that people who build things are present at the moment of launch, not celebrating exactly, but witnessing, with the specific satisfaction of people whose work is about to meet its purpose. "I needed to remember why I do it," he said. "Sometimes you have to go back to the beginning to remember what you were working toward." Marcus looked at him, nodded once, the nod of a man receiving something he will carry with him. Then he went to join the crew. Daniel stood beside Section 7C for another moment. He took the drawing from his pocket, Lily's ship, wrong hull lines, right feeling, and looked at it in the half-light of the yard's operational fixtures before the ceremony lighting fully took over. Then he folded it and put it back. He walked toward the observation platform. Claire found him at the base of the stairs, or he found her. The distinction was unclear because they were both moving toward the same point and arrived simultaneously, which seemed appropriate. She had changed into something more formal than the borrowed work boots, but the work boots were visible in the way she moved. The flatness of her stance, the groundedness of a person who had spent the afternoon doing physical things in practical footwear and had not entirely left that version of herself behind. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been composing a sentence for several hours and is now delivering it. "I owe you an apology for this morning." "You owe me a back payment," he said. 7 years of wages for work I apparently did at a doctorate level." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. The structural elements in place before the full expression arrived. Ashby will negotiate that with you tonight. She paused. He's going to offer you the chief naval architect position. The Hale situation has created a significant restructuring requirement, and the board has decided that the person they trust most with the structural integrity of this company is the person who demonstrated it today. Daniel looked at the Meridian, at the water reflecting her lights, at everything she represented. The 18 months of work, the 200 men, the contracts and the relationships and the institutional weight of a company that built things meant to last. "I'll listen," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She stood beside him, not performing anything for the assembled guests, not managing a situation, simply standing beside him in the way that people stand beside each other when they have been through a long day together and have arrived somewhere they did not expect to be, and find, against expectation, that the company is acceptable. Her shoulder was 3 inches from his. She did not move it closer. Neither did he. But when someone on the platform behind them shifted the microphone and the feedback tone cut briefly through the ceremony noise, she reached sideways without looking and steadied herself against his arm. 1 hand, 2 seconds, gone before either of them acknowledged it. The distance after that was the same 3 inches. It felt different. On the observation platform above them, someone tapped a microphone. The ceremony was beginning. The crowd shifted and settled into the particular attention of an audience, and the Meridian sat in her flooded dock with the patient authority of a vessel that had been through something and come out of it whole, which was, Daniel thought, the best thing you could say about anything built to meet the sea. The lights on her hull caught the water and threw it back in long, moving lines across the ceiling of the dry dock, and for a moment the entire space was full of light in motion, gold and white, and the particular blue of deep water, and Daniel stood in it with his daughter's drawing in his pocket and his welding gloves beside it, and 7 years of silence, finally. Not ending exactly, but opening, the way a long-held breath finally releases into something that is not relief, so much as the ordinary necessary act of breathing again. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes, and Daniel watched most of it from the yard floor rather than the observation platform, which was where he preferred to be. At the level of the work rather than above it, in the company of the men who had built the thing being celebrated rather than the people who had come to celebrate it. When the Meridian's hull lights came up full and the crowd on the platform responded with the sound of 500 people responding to the same thing at the same moment, a sound that had no individual source and came from everywhere at once, Daniel was standing beside the dry dock edge with his hands in his jacket pockets. And what he felt was not pride exactly. Pride belonged to the performance of things, and this was quieter than that. It was the feeling of watching something survive what had been intended to destroy it. A different category entirely. Ashby found him there. The board meeting lasted 11 minutes. Which was not a board meeting at all, but a conversation between 2 men who had already made their respective decisions and were confirming them. The terms were specific and fair. Daniel accepted them with the handshake that had been the binding instrument of every meaningful agreement he had made in his life, and Ashby, who was 71 years old and had been in this industry since before Daniel was born, held the handshake a beat longer than necessary in the way of a man who understands that certain moments deserve more than efficiency. Before he left the yard, he took out his phone. He had Kevin Marsh's number from a contact list he had not updated in 2 years, and had not deleted, which was its own kind of statement about the difference between anger and grief. He did not call. He typed 4 sentences the way he wrote everything, without excess, without performance, saying exactly what he meant and nothing adjacent to it. I know what happened. I know how it started. I wrote you a letter of recommendation because I believed you understood what this work meant. I still think you do. Use that. He sent it. Put the phone in his pocket. Did not wait to see if the 3 dots of a reply appeared, because that was not why he had sent it. He had sent it for the same reason he had corrected the cable routing in Tom Briggs's station that afternoon. Not because it changed what had happened, but because leaving things misrouted when you knew the correct configuration was its own kind of failure. And Daniel Rowe had spent 8 years learning that some failures were worth the effort of correction even when no one was watching. He walked to his truck, started the engine on the second turn of the key, the way it always started, reliable in the specific way of things that have been properly maintained. He drove to the hospital at 9:40. Lily was awake. Frank was still in the chair, asleep now himself, his large frame folded into the small chair with the dignified impracticality of a man who had decided to stay and had stayed. The monitor showed Lily's levels stable and correctly calibrated, green across every indicator, and she was reading a book she had apparently obtained from somewhere, a structural engineering primer with a library sticker on the spine that Daniel chose not to question. She looked up when he came in. He sat in the chair beside her bed and told her most of it. Not all. There were parts that would keep. Parts that belonged to other people's reckonings. Parts that required more distance before they could be given the shape of a story. But the essential thing he told her, in the particular directness he had always used with her because she had always deserved it. What had been in the hull? What he had found? What the day had been? She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interruption, with the focused attention of someone storing information rather than simply receiving it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared when you found the device?" she said. "Yes." "But you photographed it and backed out correctly and didn't touch it." "Yes." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Mom would say, that's just competence. Doing the right thing even when you're scared isn't courage. It's just knowing what the right thing is. She paused. She also would say you should have called someone immediately instead of waiting to tell Ms. Ashford first, but she would have understood why you didn't. Daniel looked at his daughter. At 11 years old, in a hospital bed on a Tuesday that had tested every system in both their lives and found them, provisionally, sufficient. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the drawing, her ship, wrong hull lines, right feeling, and set it on the bedside table where she could see it. She looked at it, looked at him. "You kept it." "I had it with me all day." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She reached out and straightened the drawing so it sat square on the table. The small, precise gesture of someone who cares about things being correctly positioned, which was, he thought, entirely her mother, and entirely herself, and somehow also entirely him. The accumulated inheritance of a family that had learned to hold itself together through the patient application of attention to the things within reach. Frank woke up at some point and quietly left. The departure so unobtrusive that neither of them marked the moment of it, which was exactly the way Frank Caldwell had always moved through rooms that didn't need him anymore. Lily fell asleep again around 11, the book open on her chest, and Daniel sat beside her in the specific silence of a hospital room at night. The monitor's soft rhythm, the distant sounds of the floor, the windows showing the harbor lights, and beyond them, the darkness where the Atlantic began its long work of being the Atlantic, indifferent and permanent, and considerably older than any of the things that had happened today. He thought about the Meridian sitting in her flooded dock, lights off now, the ceremony done, the guests dispersed, the vessel alone with the water, the way vessels are always ultimately alone with the water, which was not a frightening thought, but a clarifying one. He thought about the missing inspection stamp, now corrected, about the valve in Section 7C, correctly oriented, about Preston Hale in a federal facility in Richmond, and Kevin Marsh in a lawyer's office making the accounting of a terrible decision that Daniel hoped, not charitably, but accurately, had been made under a pressure that left fewer options than it appeared. He thought about Sarah, not with the specific grief that used to arrive without warning in the early years, the grief that had weight and edges and a way of occupying the entire room. This was quieter. This was the presence of a person who had become, over 8 years of absence, something more distributed than a person, a quality in the air of the places she had occupied, a voice in his daughter's particular way of being right about things, a hand in the drawing on the bedside table that she would never have drawn but somehow had informed. The midsection of his jacket, where the welding gloves sat folded, was warm from the day's wearing. He stayed until morning. 9 months later, Daniel's name appeared on the hull documentation of every vessel under Ashford Maritime's commission, not as a signature of oversight, but as the first entry in the engineering record, the way a foundation appears in blueprints, present beneath everything, visible to anyone who knew where to look. Lily had started keeping her own notebook of ship designs. The hull lines were still wrong. The proportions were getting better. The 1987 truck was still in the lot every morning when the yard opened. Oldest vehicle by a considerable margin, starting on the second turn of the key. The men who built ships for a living noted these things. They did not comment on them. They did not need to. Some things communicated themselves without assistance.